Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the House Judiciary Committee fiscal briefing. Today is Thursday, January 29th, and we have participants who will be presenting the Department of Legislative Services fiscal briefing. Great.
To the extent you have time, Madam Chair, happy to answer questions of the members. So let's get started on that page one of the document. So the governor's proposed budget is about $70.7 billion for fiscal 27. It's about a $500 million increase over the current fiscal year. It's worth noting in the current fiscal year, the governor is adding $3 billion to the current fiscal year to cover shortfalls in various agencies, particularly in the health department. Couple of key points on the budget. The governor is leaving a fund balance at the end of fiscal 27 of $108 million. He's leaving $2.2 billion in the state's rainy day fund. That's 8% of general fund revenues. Both of those were the goals of the Spending Affordability Committee, to have $100 million in cash in the general fund and to have the $2.2 billion in the rainy day fund. So he complied with those spending affordability recommendations. He's also had some success in reducing what we call the structural deficit for fiscal 27. So structural deficit is ongoing revenues versus ongoing spending. So think of it as like your checking account and your monthly bills. So it excludes savings and transfers and kind of one-time activities. And so he's reduced the structural gap for fiscal 27 from a projected $1.2 billion in December to a little under $400 million, again, meeting the Spending Affordability Committee goal. If we go to page 2, what this chart does is it shows you the balancing actions the governor's proposing that require legislation. There's certain actions he can take to cut the budget and so forth that he doesn't need legislation. There are others that he do. These actions total $1.5 billion. Without them, you would be in a shortfall of $1.4 billion. So the General Assembly either needs to adopt these or some sort of other actions to bring the budget into balance. The actions break out into sort of 3 buckets: revenues, transfers, and spending reductions. The revenues is about $356 million. $150 million of that is a transfer from what's called the local income tax reserve account. The state over allocated money to that account at the end of the past fiscal year. This is just correcting that error. The most maybe interesting items in the revenue column are the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that Congress passed back in June, July. Provided some business tax breaks, and under state law, they would flow through to the state. And the governor is proposing to decouple, so not allow some of those changes to flow through to the state. And he would generate about $130 million by decoupling from a production property depreciation provision and a bonus depreciation provision. There are other federal tax changes that the governor is proposing that we don't decouple from. So he sort of picked and chose which ones to go along with and which ones to decouple Maryland from. Under transfers to the general fund, you can see nearly $600 million. The Strategic Energy Investment Fund is the biggest transfer, nearly $260 million. This fund had a balance at the end of fiscal 25 of over $800 million. The governor's transferring quite a bit of it to the general fund, and I'll talk about later, he's proposing spending quite a bit of the rest of the balance on other things, and we'll get into that. Other notable transfers, there's a fiscal responsibility fund where we put some of our capital gains revenues when they exceed expectations into that fund to be used for capital purposes. The governor's saying, let's not do the capital, let's put that money in the general fund to balance the budget. The last one I'll mention under transfers is the Bay Restoration Fund. The governor is transferring $70 million of Bay Restoration Fund revenue to the general fund. But it's important to note he's not cutting the activities that would be supported by the $70 million. He's using general obligation bonds to support those activities. So Bay Restoration Fund activity remains fully funded, but with bonds instead of cash. Spending reductions is that third bucket. It's nearly $600 million. Biggest one is $450 million from the rainy day fund. The governor is mandated to appropriate $450 million to the rainy day fund. Because we already have $2.2 billion in the rainy day fund, he's saying we don't need to put more into the fund, let's put it into the general fund. to help balance the budget. There's a couple of other smaller reductions that I'll highlight for you, particularly because they all affect local aid. The first is teachers' retirement costs, as well as librarians and community colleges. What this governor is proposing is that counties pick up half of the increase in costs that the state would normally pick up. So it's transferring about $39 million between K through 12 teachers, librarians, and community colleges to the locals. So your county governments will be getting a bill to pay for those things that they were not expecting. The other two notable cuts related to local governments are there's a disparity grant that certain counties receive. The governor's proposing to level fund that at the fiscal 26 formula level. It was supposed to grow by, I think it was $27 million. The cut really impacts two counties in particular. $17.5 million of it impacts Prince George's County, $6 million impacts Allegheny County, and then there's smaller dollar amounts, less than $1 million, affecting a number of counties on the Eastern Shore. The other notable cut to local governments relates to community colleges. The community college formula does grow. It grows by about $11 million this year, but each individual college is capped at a growth of 3%. And that saves the state about $21 million that we otherwise would have been sending out to the community colleges. And the governor is proposing that 3% cap on each college apply in the next couple of fiscal years as well. So fiscal years 27 through 29, each community college would be limited each year to a maximum 3% growth. So those are the major reductions there. If we go to the next slide, I just want to look at the big picture here for a minute. So this looks at that structural budget outlook, and the orange bars are showing you the governor's budget plan. And the blue dotted line is the legislative services forecast we presented to spending affordability in December when they were making their recommendations for the budget. And as you can see, in fiscal 27, the governor substantially reduced that structural gap. His budget makes some progress in his estimates for fiscal 28, but you can see it's still more than a $2 billion hole in fiscal 28. And then as you see in the out years, it's very similar to what we were forecasting in December, with the structural gap projected to reach $4 billion by the governor's estimates in 2031. So this year's budget won't be especially difficult to balance, but as you can see in the next term, there's going to be substantial challenges to balance the budget. We turn to the next slide. All right, so we shift gears a little bit here, and we look at what the legislative services forecast was back in December versus what the governor did. And he reduced the cash deficit by $1.6 billion. And the pie chart shows you 3/4 of the solution is spending reductions versus what we were forecasting. And if you look at the next page, we try to highlight for you sort of the surprises in the governor's budget, the places he put less in than we were expecting, and a few places he put more money in than we're expecting. The biggest surprise was the items that went through the nearly $600 million in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act that require legislation. There's another about $345 million of simply fund swaps where the governor identified federal funds or special funds that could substitute for general funds. So it's not really a cut to the programs, it's just finding a different funding source. But there are some things that are notable in terms of cuts or less funding than expected. The third item from the left there, behavioral health Medicaid funding is about $170 million less than we were forecasting. There's no cost containment being proposed, or no notable cost containment being proposed by the governor. They're just assuming less growth than we were forecasting. So we're a little bit concerned that there might be underfunding of that entitlement program. And we'll be taking a closer look with the budget committees in terms of whether that's the appropriate level of funding or not. A couple of lines further along, there's $150 million of cost containment proposed in the Developmental Disabilities Administration. So you recall this was a major issue last session. The General Assembly restored a fair amount of money to the budget last year to mitigate a lot of the cost containment. The governor's proposing many of the same types of changes as last year. So I think that'll again be a significant issue for the budget committees. The other thing I would note is there's savings by providing no rate increases for health and human services providers. We were anticipating about a 2% rate increase for fiscal 27. None of them get any rate increase. In a bit of a departure from kind of long-standing tradition, state employees are getting a 1.5% cost of living increase in the budget while the providers are not getting anything. Usually, while they're not necessarily aligned, you see those two go up or stay flat in a similar manner. On the far right of that chart, you can see that something we're calling initiatives and enhancements, where there's a fair amount of additional spending. Broke out the things that we've identified thus far on page 6. A lot of detail there on where the additional spending is. I'll just hit a couple of things here. There's $30 million for legislative priorities. So since the General Assembly gained the ability to add to the budget, it's had to make cuts to find the room for the ads. The governor's actually setting aside $30 million as a placeholder for the legislature this year. So even before making cuts, there's some capacity for the General Assembly to add to the budget. There's another $30 million for public safety to deal with emergency facility maintenance. And then as you kind of go down the list, you can see there's a number of things that are economic development related. IonQ gets $20 million for their new headquarters. They got $10 million last year. There's $16 million for the Sunny Day Fund, which the state can use for business attraction purposes, essentially. The governor also put $16 million into that fund last year. None of that money has been used to date, so this would get that fund up to $32 million to spend. The Governor's Enough Act gets an additional $15 million. And one other item of note, back in November, the governor announced that there had been an agreement with AstraZeneca that they would expand a facility in Frederick and build a new facility in Gaithersburg, and the state would provide them with $15 million a year for 8 years as kind of to help them with those costs. And this is the first year that you see money in the budget for AstraZeneca. There's a lot of other items there you can peruse at your leisure. And we'll go to the next slide. All right, this chart near the top of this page focuses on that Strategic Energy Investment Fund. So as I mentioned, they had a very large balance at the end of fiscal 25. Their revenues have been growing rapidly in recent years. So the governor's proposing using about $333 million of the balance to help with the operating and capital budget. So he transfers a total of $292 million just to the general fund. He spends another $30 million on capital projects that are, clean energy related, so that it feels like it's a reasonable use of the CEF funds. And then there's some fund swaps in various state agencies where they have costs that are CEF eligible, where the governor's proposing to use CEF funds rather than general funds. And then there's nearly $400 million of new investments, is what we're calling it here. I'm going to highlight two. Last year, the General Assembly passed legislation that set aside $200 million of CEF money to provide ratepayer relief. There was two $40 discounts for people on their bills. The governor's proposing $100 million this year, which would allow for one $40 discount for all the ratepayers. He's also proposing a new $100 million of expenditures for incentives for solar and clean energy projects. The justification for this is apparently the federal government has cut back its subsidies for those kind of projects, and this is trying to backfill for those activities in Maryland. One other thing I'll note is there's $42 million of CEF money being sent to higher education research centers, $25 million for the university system, $8.5 million from Morgan State University, and $8.5 million for Johns Hopkins, to do more research in energy, resiliency, and climate issues. This appears to be a one-time expenditure, so we'll be discussing this with the budget committees, whether that makes sense or it feels like it'll become an ongoing commitment. So there's some concern about how that's going to get used. So those are kind of highlights of CEF. The first bullet under the CEF chart just talks about K-12 education for a minute. The budget grows by nearly $360 million of education aid to the school systems, about a 4% increase. It's notable that $228 million of that is essentially a discretionary decision by the governor. The number of students identified as free and reduced price meal eligible was going to drop by about 33,000 because schools who are community eligibility provision participants had a hold harmless in state law through fiscal 26 that guaranteed them a certain percentage of their students would be considered farms eligible. That sunsetted at the end of fiscal 26, and as a result, those schools were going to see a 33,000 student drop in their farms counts. The governor has proposed legislation to not sunset that provision, keep the hold harmless for those schools in place, and that results in about $228 million more of spending on compensatory education and concentration of poverty grants. Most of that money goes to Baltimore City, Prince George's County, and Montgomery County, which were the most impacted by the CEP provision. If we go to the next slide, there's a lot of bullets here on different topics. I just want to actually highlight the first one, which is the One Big Beautiful Bill also has some spending impacts on the state. There's $56 million of state funding being spent in fiscal 27 to implement that bill, about $43 million for SNAP, because the federal government has shifted a higher share of administrative costs for SNAP to all the states, and we're going to need to spend an additional $43 million of state funds to provide the 75% match. And there's also $13 million of state funds to implement the various Medicaid work provisions and other more frequent eligibility redetermination provisions for certain adults. So there's some money in the budget to implement that. There's a lot of bullets here on different topics that I'll let you look at at your leisure. Turning to the next page, potential legislative issues. So we just highlight kind of the major, what we see as fiscal issues for the session, probably some of them for the next term. The first, as you saw with that structural deficit that we're facing, that's certainly a major long-term issue for the state. Second concern, it just remains, the uncertainty about what other federal actions might be coming. Will there be more federal workforce cuts? Will there be more cuts to grants to state and local governments? Those are certainly risks to our budget and to our revenue, on both the revenue side and the spending side. Third issue for the General Assembly is certainly the One Big Beautiful Bill Act business tax provisions and whether we decouple or let those be implemented in Maryland, through the Maryland tax code as well. As I mentioned, the governor's proposing decoupling from two. The two he's not proposing decoupling for are highlighted there in the bullets. One is a provision allowing businesses to deduct all research and experimental expenditures in the first year when they incur those expenses rather than depreciating them over a multi-year period. And the other relates to the treatment of business interest expenses. And those two, the governor is saying, let's go along with the federal change, let it flow through to Maryland taxes. I mentioned before, we're concerned about the adequacy of the behavioral health funding, so that'll certainly be an issue for the budget committees. Also some concern, the Department Office of Legislative Audits in December released a closeout audit for fiscal 25. And one of their findings was that there was about $1.4 billion of costs that the Department of Transportation has charged to federal funds that they couldn't find documentation to support that we're going to actually be able to obtain those funds. So this is obviously a concern. I mean, I think just based on previous legislative audits with other agencies that have somewhat similar findings, quite a bit of this money will likely be realized. And I don't think you're going to see a short $1.4 billion. But there is certainly a risk that some significant amount will not be recovered, and that'll be a hit to the Transportation Trust Fund, as the state would need to pay those costs if we don't receive the federal dollars. So that has, potential impacts on sort of the plan for transportation spending over the next few years. So that'll certainly be an issue that needs to be delved into further. The last issue I'll mention here is the Child Victims Act. There have been 12,000 claims filed that were filed before June 1st when the cap on liabilities dropped from 890,000 to 400,000, depending on when you filed. There's not really been any progress on resolving those cases, but it obviously is an enormous liability for the state. So in addition to the structural budget, in the next term, I think you're going to have to think about how to pay for whatever liability we end up needing to pay out. So that's a sort of a second very large challenge for the state from a financial standpoint. Last thing I'm going to talk about is the next slide. This just looks at the Blueprint Fund and the implementation of the Blueprint program, or the Kerwin initiatives, if you will. And you may have seen, we've shown this chart for a few years. It shows both the costs each year of implementing the Blueprint. You can see they grow steadily. And then it shows how we're paying for it. And the blue bars are, there's certain revenues that come in each year that go to the Blueprint Fund. A lot of revenues from the casinos, a certain portion of our sales tax revenues, sports gaming revenues. And that's a pretty steady amount of money, and you can see that's the blue bar, and it funds a certain share of the cost. For fiscal years 25 through the 27 budget, you can see the rest of the costs are being funded with the green color section, which is cash balance in the Blueprint Fund. Back when we had big surpluses in the state put a lot of money into the Blueprint Fund, knowing we had these big implementation costs coming. And that's been very helpful, and has helped us fund it through fiscal 27. But we've pretty much depleted that sort of surplus in the fund. There's a little over 100 million, it's hard to see in the graphic, but in fiscal 28, it's still available. So that means starting in fiscal 28, the general fund has to supplement the Blueprint Fund cover the implementation costs. And you can see that is going to result in a very substantial increase in general fund spending, reaching $3.4 billion by 2031. And that is certainly a major driver of the state's fiscal distress, that we showed you in that structural outlook. Madam Chair, that was my kind of quick overview of the budget. Happy to take any questions if the committee has time.
Thank you very much. And members, if you go to the MGA website, and if you go under budget publications, you'll get the 2026 fiscal briefing that you can look at in case you have any questions that you can't think of now. You addressed the one question I did have, and that was the funding. Looks like a funding loss for behavioral health of $170 million. And I just wanted to make sure I read that right, and it's not being put somewhere else, because then you were talking about the TTF, and I wasn't sure if that was somehow relevant to the $170 million loss.
Now, the behavioral health is essentially, the administration is expecting very little growth in behavioral health. We were forecasting much greater growth. One of the things we've seen over the last 2 years is there's been a significant surge in utilization of behavioral health services, mainly by adults, interestingly, in the Medicaid program. And there's been big jumps in that demand, and that's created a lot of fiscal distress. And the administration seems to be assuming that that surge is going to slow or, level off. And we were assuming some continuation of that trend. So that's the primary reason for the difference in forecasts. And like I say, we'll update our forecast, look at it, and we'll have a few more months of data to look at when we do so.
Very good. Thank you. Delegate Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, I had a similar question on page 5 with regard to behavioral health. I needed to make sure you are talking about just Medicaid-associated behavioral health programs, right?
Correct.
Okay, that's one. And I do know that there's a moratorium on new providers in this space. So that may be one reason why we're not going to take any new clients, because we're not licensing new providers. So right now, there's no capacity. I also, no provider rate increases. What's a provider? Who are you talking about? Are you talking about Medicaid providers? What providers?
I'm talking about people who serve the developmentally disabled, people who provide behavioral health services through Medicaid, other community-based Medicaid providers, as well as nursing homes, home health aides, all those sort of programs. And also in the human service areas, like the group homes that serve foster children or people in the juvenile service system, all of those providers are receiving no rate increase.
Got it. Thank you. And is that, are those provider rate increases, is that static or just for next year, or is it?
Just for fiscal 27.
We're not looking at just for the 27. Okay. Page 6. There's emergency maintenance in the DPSCS facilities. Is that specifically targeted at that one? Which one was it, you guys, that the governor said he was going to close?
The closing part of Jessup, the MCI Jessup.
So is that still closing, and this emergency maintenance is for other facilities that need?
That's my understanding, exactly what you said, that it's for other facilities.
Okay, all right. And also on the same page, there's a Monteview Senior Living Facility. Mm-hmm. What is that and where is that?
I will have to get, I looked this up, but I have forgotten where it is. But it's an assisted living center that the state is giving some cash, but it's for capital purposes to do some renovations to.
I'd love to know how you apply for that, but that's All right, page 9. When you talk about decoupling, I guess I'm not real clear on what that term means, and especially with regard to bullet 3, where we're decoupling from a provision, increasing the amount of business interest expenses that can be deducted. So, we have business interests that can be deducted. Are you saying we can no longer, just explain that to me a little further.
So just to back up on the concept of decoupling is, so there's all these business tax provisions that were in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Most of them would flow through so that if they're changing if they're letting you depreciate something all in year one rather than over 20 years, the same thing would then apply on your Maryland taxes for that business. They would get the break on both the federal and the state. But the state has the option of saying, no, we want to continue with the old practice of depreciating over, say, 20 years rather than one. So the decoupling is the question of, do we go along with the federal change, or do we like the way Maryland law was before? I should just also explain, Maryland automatically decoupled for tax year 25 from any provision that had a fiscal impact of more than $5 million. So for the first year of that bill, we decoupled, and that's in state statute. Because the General Assembly years ago decided when the federal government makes changes, the General Assembly should get an opportunity to look at it and decide, do we want to go along with that or not? So that's why these issues are all before you this session. So what Congress did for the interest expense is to provide opportunity essentially for businesses to deduct more costs. And so the question is, and the governor is saying, yeah, let's go along with that and let them also deduct those costs on their Maryland taxes.
So this is where we're going along with it, or we're decoupling from that?
No, he's on the two on that page that I highlight, he's saying, let's go along with those two. And there were two other provisions I talked about on page 2 that he's saying, no, let's decouple from those. So he kind of picked and chose which ones he thought were, I think the administration would tell you they chose the ones that they thought would be most important to attracting business and maintaining business in Maryland.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have just two questions, actually. Is there a cut to developmental disability services?
There is a proposal to reduce funding by $150 million of state funds, which with federal match is really about $300 million total through four different cost containment provisions that do not require legislation. They were just part of the budget plan.
Okay. And let me look up my other question before I ask, just to be sure. Hold on one second. Delegate Conaway?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming in to give us this briefing. How much of the teacher salary transfers would affect Baltimore City?
If you're looking at the bigger document, page 56 shows the impact of all these local aid provisions by jurisdiction. The retirement payment provision would impact Baltimore City to $3.2 million.
And that's for 1 year?
That is a permanent $3.2 million cost that the city will incur.
That's every year?
Every year starting with fiscal 27, yes, sir.
And does that include the pay increase of that's down from the 2% to the 1.5%?
The pay increase issue is just for state employees. It has nothing to do with teachers. Each school system makes its own decisions on teacher salaries.
Okay. And how long will the 33,000 students receive the free lunch program? How long will that be extended?
So the bill that it's in only does it for 1 year, but the governor's budget forecast assumes it's permanent. So I think it's a little unclear at this point what the proposal is.
So I should write down unclear? I'll be
Yes.
good with that. Okay. And what do you mean the 1.4 billion in the transportation fund usage can't be documented? How long do we have to document that before we have to, before we have to pay it?
So legislative audits went in and looked at the data at the end of fiscal 25. So it was mainly charges during fiscal 25, and there wasn't evidence that the federal government had said, yeah, we're going to pay for that. And now the Department of Transportation would tell you that they think that they need to send paperwork to the Federal Department of Transportation, but they expect the federal government will approve most of those charges, but they just the paperwork hadn't flowed to the federal government, and we hadn't gotten back, an affirmative, yes, you can spend the money on that.
Okay. And so in the sex settlement cases, what you said the payout of in the next term is going to be higher than what it is now.
Well, so the maximum payout for each claimant is $890,000.
Yes.
And as I said, there were 12,000 claims. I don't know for sure those are all individual claimants or if there's some duplication, but I think that for the most part they are individual claimants. So the potential liability, if you multiply 890,000 times,
I can't do the math.
it's
so-
like $10 billion is the maximum, like the worst case scenario, everybody could get the maximum amount, which is very unlikely to happen because the severity
Okay,
of
so
these cases is.
let's call it 3 billion. So if we just trim it down, let's call it 2 billion. So if we trim it down to 2 billion, 2.5, that would be due next term?
Well, so there either needs to be a settlement where we agree that, yeah, we agree we're gonna pay 2 billion and, and there'll have to be some period of years that we pay that out over, whether it's in 1 year or a multi-year period. Or these cases will all go to court and, there'll be rulings on the individual cases. There does not appear to have been any progress to date on this in any of the settlement discussions. So I'm thinking we're not gonna have a resolution before the next term.
So we didn't have any progress on that since last term?
The last I heard, there hasn't been, there's just, the state and the plaintiffs are far apart on what they think is a reasonable, settlement. So
Okay.
I'm sure you all will talk to the Attorney General at some point. I think it's worth asking the Attorney General where things are.
Yes, and my last question, and thank you, Chair. How much does a 1 penny tax deduction or increase, how much would that mean to the budget?
1 penny on the sales tax is roughly $1 billion.
$1 billion. Thank you so very much.
Sure.
Thank you. Delegate Simmons?
Madam Chairman. Thank you, and appreciate you coming out. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Enough Act and where we are with the funding streams currently in place throughout our communities, and has there been a reduction in those initial allocations?
Yeah, the governor's proposing spending a little over $30 million in fiscal 27 on the Enough Act, which is more than was expected. So he's maintaining a substantial investment in that program.
Is there projected reductions in that allocation, or are y'all still on track?
I mean, the governor's proposing no reductions in the Enough Act. And obviously, the General Assembly has the opportunity to make changes, so that'll be it.
All right, thank you.
Decision point for appropriations.
Delegate Congola?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have just a general overall question. So it sounds like the budget is relying heavily on reductions, cuts to certain programs. Is there anything in the budget regarding increasing revenue? You mentioned AstraZeneca, but what are we doing to actually bring revenue to the state?
Yeah, I mean, there's. This isn't my budget, so I'll say there are various investments. AstraZeneca, there's more money for investments in the quantum initiative around College Park, the IonQ headquarters. So there's various money going to businesses to try to attract and expand their activities here. And as I mentioned, there's also $16 million being put into the Sunny Day Fund, which is a fund that the governor can use when a good business opportunity comes along to attract a company or keep a company from fleeing Maryland, the Sunny Day can be used. So he's putting $16 million in his budget. He did the same last year, and they haven't spent any of that. So there's $32 million there for business attraction. So, and I suppose if you ask the administration, that they would say that the choice not to decouple from certain federal tax provisions is another item that they're doing to try to make Maryland maintain some level of attractiveness to business.
Okay, thank you. I just have one more question. So the blueprint, so you said that a lot of the revenue, I didn't catch all of the sources of revenue, but you mentioned sports, gaming, casinos, some others. But then you also mentioned that currently the cash balance is at $100 million. So on average, what have we spent annually so far? I mean, we have right now on hand $100 million. What have we on average spent for a blueprint?
Well, that graphic that's on the screen on page 10 of the document shows in fiscal 25, we spent nearly $2 billion implementing the blueprint. In fiscal 27, that number will approach $3 billion of costs. And by fiscal 31, it's going to be nearly $6 billion. So it's a
Okay,
substantial
and then that money, if the cash balance isn't going to be able to sustain that, and you said that money is then going to have to come from the general fund?
Right, and barring the General Assembly finding some other revenue source, the general fund would have to supplement the annual blueprint revenues for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Cardin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again. You come here and you do a great job making sure that those of us who aren't in the budget world understand this stuff. So really appreciate it. And actually, most of my questions, I think all but one of my questions were asked by everybody else. So, which is great because I have to be in Ways and Means to testify in a minute. The only question I have left is federal aid. You talked about, we're thinking about whether additional federal aid may be cut and where that could come from, and we have to be prepared to deal with that, perhaps this year, next year. Is the Department of Legislative Services doing any analysis of what could be easily cut based on sort of what's happening around the country or what's happened in the federal administration, so that we're prepared to kind of brief us quickly on how that might be happening and how much money we could be talking about?
I think the biggest risk to states in general, but and to Maryland, I mean, there's obviously, we've seen a lot of research dollars for higher ed cut already, and that's a risk. But the biggest risk to the state budget on the cut side is the Medicaid program, which we get billions and billions of federal dollars from. And there was a lot of concern, you know, before the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed, that there was going to be a substantial cost shift to states. And ultimately that didn't happen. There were the cuts that more impact recipients in terms of work requirements and so forth. But if the federal government were to come back at some point and say states need to pay an additional 5% of Medicaid costs, that would be you know, an enormous hit to the state budget, and it would be true for every state in the country. So I think that's the biggest concern out there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Stinnett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And my apologies if I'm repeating a question because I stepped out for a couple of seconds. But in terms of HBCUs within the budget, there was, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a tobacco settlement as far as that that funds was allocated to the HBCUs, and now it's being pulled.
So yeah, so this is complicated. So let me start with I guess about the good news. So the state law requires about roughly $60 million for the HBCU settlement payments to the schools this year. That is fully funded in the budget. So that's the good news. The HBCUs are getting what is expected. You're right. Under state law, there's a second settlement, the cigarette restitution fund, the whole tobacco settlement. There's a substantial arbitration going on about many years past, you know, money that's been set in escrow and whether the state should receive it or not. The budget assumes that we receive $70 million through favorable arbitration rulings, and so some of them have already happened. So we are going to get some, if not all, of that $70 million. Under state law, that money should all go to support the HBCU settlement in fiscal 27 and in future fiscal years if it's more than necessary in 27. What the governor did is he said, let's take 35 million of it and use that for the HBCU settlement. Let's use the other 35 for Medicaid. But he kept the HBCU settlement whole by putting general funds in to get to the 60 million. I know this sounds like a lot of movement of money, and why. I think the reason is that they're pretty sure we're going to get the 35 million. They're not sure we're going to really get the 70 million in fiscal 27, and that the governor was trying to avoid funding the HBCU settlement with money that might not actually materialize. So I think that's why he used some general funds and put the risk on the Medicaid program rather than on the settlement.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mr. Romans, as usual, you did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes our fiscal briefing. We are going to start our bill hearings at what time is it? 2:55. 2:55. 1:55. Okay, sorry. So 5 minutes before 2, we're going to start our bill hearings. It's okay to be a little bit ahead. Okay, I'll see you then. Thanks.